So, in the summer of 1596, this 11-year-old boy was buried in an unmarked grave.
Right.
And then, just 4 years later, his father wrote a play sharing his exact name.
A play that would totally dominate global culture, yeah.
Exactly. It shapes our whole modern understanding of human psychology. But if you actually look at the historical ledger, there's this gaping 4-year black hole right between those two events.
Yeah, it's a complete void.
Welcome to all the cinephiles joining us today for this Between the Lines analysis. Usually when we look back at the historical record, there's this persistent illusion that we're looking at a complete skeleton.
Oh, absolutely. We see the dates, the parish registries.
The neat little lists of births and deaths, yeah. And we trick ourselves into thinking we have the full shape of the beast. But then you encounter a story like this one, the story of Hamnet Shakespeare, and you realize you aren't looking at a complete skeleton at all.
Not even close.
Right. What you actually have is a fossil with missing bones. And today, we are stepping right into that void.
It really is the ultimate biographical blank slate. I mean, we have these rigid, calcified facts entered into ledger books in Stratford-upon-Avon, but the connective tissue, the muscle,
The actual beating heart.
exactly, the beating heart of what happened in that household between the summer of 1596 and the debut of Hamlet around 1599, it's just completely lost to time.
Gone.
Yeah. So the mission of our deep dive today isn't just to summarize the plot of Chloé Zhao's adaptation of Hamnet.
Right, because we assume you guys already know the basics.
Yeah. Our goal today is to unearth the technical filmmaking secrets, decode the visual grammar, and analyze the intensely immersive behind-the-scenes lore.
Which is just wild, by the way.
It really is. We want to see how a modern director took this historical silence and translated it into a prestige cinematic masterpiece. We're going to explore how cinematic art, rigorous psychological acting methods, and incredibly detailed sensory production design were all used to reconstruct that missing creature.
To make it breathe again.
Yes, to make it breathe.
I want to start by looking closely at the foundation of this mystery, because the historical paradox at the center of this story is just staggering to me.
The 4-year gap.
Yeah, this profound silence. The burial of the child, Hamnet, and the debut of arguably the greatest tragedy in human history, Hamlet.
Mm-hmm.
For a long time, traditional literary scholars, they wanted to keep these two things in completely separate boxes, right?
Oh, yeah. They wanted to look at the literary source material and say, well, Hamlet is just an adaptation of a 12th century Scandinavian folk tale.
Right, about a figure named Amleth.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Just a professional adaptation, nothing more.
Which feels so dismissive.
It does.
Yeah.
But that was the comfortable academic consensus for centuries. Because, it's much easier to view Shakespeare as this detached genius pulling from ancient myths than as a grieving father bleeding his personal trauma onto the page.
But the film Hamnet utterly rejects that view.
Completely rejects it.
Really?
And to understand why, you have to understand a crucial linguistic reality of Elizabethan England.
The spelling conventions, right?
Yeah, in the 16th century, spelling and naming conventions were not standardized at all. They were incredibly fluid, often just determined by the phonetic interpretation of whoever happened to be holding the quill that day.
Which is crazy to think about now.
It is. So in the parish records of the time, the names Hamnet and Hamlet were not distinct.
Wait, really? Not distinct at all?
No, they were virtually interchangeable. They were, for all legal and social intents and purposes, the exact same name.
Wow. Which completely shifts the context of the play.
Totally.
It means we aren't just looking at a linguistic coincidence, we are looking at a survival mechanism. It implies a grieving father taking the very name of his dead son and literally immortalizing it.
Putting it in the mouths of actors on the global stage.
So that it would be spoken every single day. As the scholar Stephen Greenblatt argues, and his work is deliberately quoted at the very start of the film, the inward life of the playwright was irreparably shattered and rebuilt by this passing.
And what's so compelling about Zhao's adaptation, which, stems from Maggie O'Farrell's novel, is how it takes this academic debate and makes a definitive, uncompromising choice.
It picks a side.
It absolutely sides with the biographical critics. It posits that separating the creation of the play from the death of the boy is a failure of empathy.
A failure of empathy. I love that.
Yeah. But to tell that story, to accurately map that 4-year gap, the film makes a really radical structural decision.
Shifting the center of gravity.
Right, away from the famous playwright, who's often away in London anyway, and placing it squarely onto a figure who has been historically marginalized, misunderstood, and honestly frequently mocked.
The wife.
The wife.
And this brings us to a fascinating detail that hits you the second the film starts. The film completely, almost aggressively, discards the famous name Anne Hathaway.
Yes.
She is referred to exclusively from beginning to end as Agnes. Now, I have to ask, why erase the one piece of branding everyone actually knows? Anne Hathaway is a globally recognized historical name. Changing it to Agnes feels almost like a deliberate provocation to the audience.
Oh, it is a provocation. And a highly necessary one, I'd argue. You have to understand the centuries of historical baggage and, frankly, misogynistic assumptions that have encrusted the name Anne Hathaway.
Like the supporting wife tropes.
Exactly. If you trace the historical narrative, Anne Hathaway has been reduced in popular culture to this very specific dismissive trope. She's historically portrayed as the older, uneducated provincial woman who, trapped a young, soaring literary genius into an unwanted marriage because she got pregnant.
Right, because she was 26 and William was 18 when they married.
Yeah, so she's usually depicted as the anchor dragging down his genius.
The woman he had to escape to London to get away from.
Exactly. But the historical truth is much more complex. The name Agnes isn't an invention by O'Farrell or Zhao. It's actually the name used for her in her own father's will.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, Richard Hathaway referred to her as my daughter Agnes.
Okay, so by reverting to this name, the film is systematically stripping away all of those Victorian-era preconceived notions.
It's a total reset of the character's identity.
Mm.
She's no longer an inconvenient historical footnote. By calling her Agnes, they elevate her to this mystical, commanding presence at the very center of the narrative.
Reframing the age gap, too.
Right. Not as something scandalous or entrapment, but as something deeply necessary for his development. She has this fierce central agency. She's the one deeply connected to the earth, to biology.
To the actual reality of life and death.
Exactly, while William is off living in the abstract world of words.
I love that concept, that by changing a single historical name, you can force the audience to see a character for the first time. So we have the name Agnes, restoring her historical dignity, and we have Hamnet serving as the raw material for Hamlet.
Yeah.
But then we hit the cause of death, and this is where I really need to push back on the film's narrative choices.
Okay, let's get into it.
Because the film depicts the bubonic plague sweeping through Stratford-upon-Avon. We see this immense cosmic horror, the terrifying red X's painted on the doors, the forced quarantines, the bodies piling up in the streets.
It's incredibly visceral.
It is. But if you look at the actual historical record, historians find absolutely no evidence of a plague epidemic in Stratford in August of 1596.
That's true.
So doesn't artificially inflating a deeply personal, intimate family tragedy into an apocalyptic plague risk overshadowing the quiet reality of their actual grief? I mean, why choose the plague?
It is a massive historical liberty to take. I will definitely grant you that. The parish records from Holy Trinity Church confirm Hamnet was buried on August 11, 1596, but they provide absolutely no cause of death.
There's another blank space.
Just a blank space. Historians suggest it might have been an isolated malady, like dysentery or typhus, or as the academic Germaine Greer has theorized, perhaps a congenital defect. But to answer your question about why a filmmaker dedicated to authenticity would invent a plague, you have to look at the underlying mechanism of Chloé Zhao's overarching aesthetic.
Okay, unpack that for me.
The plague in Hamnet isn't a cheap historical plot device. It serves the structural narrative function. It elevates a localized tragedy into a cosmic clash.
But a cosmic clash seems so counterintuitive to an intimate story about losing a child. Explain how inflating the scale of the threat actually serves the emotional truth.
Well, think about the biological reality of grief. When you lose a child, it doesn't feel like a quiet, isolated medical anomaly.
No.
It feels like the end of the world. It feels apocalyptic. And a recurring pillar in all of Zhao's cinematic work is the terrifying clash between human civilization and the raw, indifferent power of nature.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. By introducing the bubonic plague, the film physically manifests the internal emotional state of the characters. It pits the fragile human ecosystem of 1590 Stratford against an unstoppable, invisible, sentient force of nature.
So the pestilence becomes a character.
Exactly. A congenital defect is a tragedy of biology, but the plague, with its mass graves and societal collapse, forces the characters into a confrontation with mortality on a scale that actually matches the sheer devastation they are feeling internally.
The external environment has to be as terrifying as their internal landscape.
You nailed it.
Okay, I see the mechanism there. If you want the audience to feel the world-ending weight of the loss, you have to literally show their world ending.
Exactly.
And speaking of Chloe's aesthetic and how she visualizes these massive emotional shifts, this pivot from rigid historical facts to these massive cosmic truths kind of mirrors her own unexpected journey to this material, doesn't it?
Oh, completely.
Because on paper, she seems like the absolute wrong choice for this movie.
She really does. If you
Yeah.
look at her filmography, like Songs My Brothers Taught Me, The Writer, Nomadland,
Right. She's known for the wide-open, sprawling horizons of the American West.
she is the ultimate nomadic director.
Mm.
She shoots in expansive modern landscapes with non-professional actors playing versions of themselves.
Yeah.
So the idea of her stepping into a cramped 16th century British period drama with actors wearing corsets and speaking early modern English, it just seems entirely incongruous.
And the behind-the-scenes lore confirms that she felt the exact same way. She initially rejected this project entirely.
She did.
But what fascinated me wasn't just that she said no, it was her specific reasoning. She didn't reject it because she disliked the period setting. She rejected it because she isn't a mother.
Right.
And she felt she simply couldn't relate to the core theme of profound maternal grief. She genuinely didn't feel she had the ethical or emotional right to tell Agnes's story.
Which demonstrates a remarkable level of artistic integrity, honestly. She recognized the immense psychological weight of the material and hesitated to appropriate an experience she hadn't lived.
But then she changed her mind.
Yeah. And what changed her mind is a perfect example of how cinematic history is often shaped by sheer, unpredictable serendipity. It all traces back to a chance encounter at the Telluride Film Festival.
The Telluride catalyst, I want you to unpack this for me, because we know she ran into Paul Mescal there.
Yes.
But this was before he was the massive global star of Gladiator II, or even before she had seen his devastating Oscar-nominated performance in Aftersun.
Right, he was still relatively new.
So what exactly was the specific energy he possessed that made a director completely reverse her stance on a project?
Well, it wasn't about his fame. It was about his physical and emotional presence. The traditional cultural image of William Shakespeare is incredibly stiff, right? He is the balding man in the ruffled collar, staring blankly from a painting.
An institution, not a human being.
Exactly. But according to the lore, when Zhao met Mescal, he possessed this incredibly grounded, fresh, and authentic energy. Mescal has this unique ability to project deep, churning internal intellect while physically carrying himself like a regular, robust, vital human being.
Oh, that's a great way to describe him.
He completely shattered her preconceived notions of what a historical playwright had to look or feel like. He convinced her that a young, virile, deeply emotional Shakespeare was actually possible to put on screen.
Wow.
And it was Mescal who practically forced her to read Maggie O'Farrell's book.
Which she later described as an earthquake.
Yeah, an earthquake.
Yeah.
It totally shook the foundation of her reluctance.
And it's fascinating because once she saw that potential for fresh authenticity, she demanded it from the rest of the cast. Which brings us to the legendary chemistry read between Paul Mescal and Jessie Buckley.
Oh, this is such a good story.
The lore within Focus Features is that the producers described this chemistry read as completely unnecessary.
They called it unnecessary because the second the two actors occupied the same physical space, the casting was a foregone conclusion.
It's just obvious.
Completely. But let's look at the mechanics of why that chemistry was so immediate. Mescal and Buckley had actually worked on the film The Lost Daughter together previously.
Oh.
But remarkably, they had never shared a single scene. They were orbiting each other in the industry, highly aware of each other's talents, but they hadn't actually collided creatively.
So when they finally do collide in this room, what exactly is happening? The producers reported being rendered completely speechless by the kinetic energy between them. They said the actors practically forgot they were saying lines.
Yeah.
But kinetic energy is such a vague Hollywood buzzword. How does that actually manifest in a performance?
It manifests as a closed-loop feedback system. When two actors of this caliber operate together, they stop acting at each other and start reacting strictly to the biological and emotional cues of the other person.
So they aren't just reciting lines.
Exactly. Jessie Buckley has spoken about this quite candidly. She noted that Paul Mescal allowed her to access the fullest version of her character because they didn't try to over-intellectualize the dynamic in rehearsals.
No whiteboards.
Right. They didn't sit down and map out their character arcs. They maintained a level of mutual mystery. So when the camera rolled, one actor's unscripted micro-expression.
Like a shift in the eyes or a change in breathing.
Exactly. That micro-expression instantly recalibrated the other's emotional baseline, completely bypassing the conscious brain and the script itself. It wasn't a performance. It was an immediate, primal, lived connection.
It's the friction of two people falling deeply, mystically in love, and then having to use that exact same neural pathway to experience being torn apart by unimaginable loss.
Wonderfully put.
But to capture a performance that primal, you can't just rely on the adults in the room. You need the entire ecosystem of the family to feel biologically real. And this is where Zhao made one of the most brilliant, intuitive casting decisions of the entire production: the sibling ghosts.
Yes. Casting the twins, Hamnet and Judith, is arguably the highest stakes decision in the film.
Right.
Because if the audience doesn't believe in the profound, almost supernatural bond between these two children, the entire emotional architecture of the film just collapses.
The stakes are incredibly high.
Very high. The casting director, Nina Gold, didn't just look for child actors who happened to look alike or who could, hit their marks. She prioritized finding actors who possessed a special empathetic bond and who could handle the incredibly demanding psychological weight of playing out a prolonged death scene.
Right.
So she cast Jacoby Joof as the 11-year-old Hamnet and Olivia Lyons as his twin, Judith. But the stroke of absolute genius was casting Jacoby's real-life older brother, Noah Jupe.
Yes. Noah Jupe, who plays the older version of Hamlet on the stage at the Globe Theater in the film's climax.
Precisely. Let's break down the psychological mechanism of why this works so brilliantly. It was a purposeful casting decision designed to create a visceral visual ghost for the audience.
Okay, tell me more.
At the end of the film, Agnes travels to London, stands in the crowd at the Globe Theater, and looks up at the stage to see a theatrical representation of her dead son. But because the production cast Noah Jupe, who shares a genuine biological resemblance, the exact same bone structure and real-life brotherhood with Jacoby Jupe.
Who we just watched an hour earlier.
Yeah.
Exactly. The emotional resonance bypasses the audience's critical thinking.
It's a direct shortcut to the subconscious, because if they had just used a random actor in heavy makeup to look like the younger kid, our brains would be analyzing the prosthetic work, right?
Exactly. We'd be distracted.
You would be thinking, oh, they did a good job making him look similar. But by using actual genetics, our brain simply recognizes the biological echo of the dead child. The audience doesn't have to work to see the connection. It just suspends our disbelief entirely.
It is devastating because it is biologically true on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
But to hold performances that are this rooted in raw biology and subconscious truth, Zhao understood a fundamental rule of filmmaking.
Yeah.
You cannot put primal performances inside a sterile environment.
Oh, absolutely not.
Standard, stiff period piece environments
Yeah.
where every prop is perfectly placed and the costumes look like they just arrived from a dry cleaner.
Those would instantly kill the reality the actors were trying to build.
Totally. She had to construct an entirely immersive, breathing ecosystem.
Which perfectly transitions us into the visual language of the film. Because if the internal landscape of these characters is this volatile and messy, how does the camera physically capture that without feeling intrusive or artificial?
That's the challenge.
And this is where we have to talk about the incredible collaboration between Chloé Zhao and her cinematographer, Chloé Zhao. For our listeners who track technical achievements in cinema, Zhao's name is huge. He's known for his extraordinary Academy Award-nominated work on films like Cold War and The Zone of Interest.
His work is phenomenal. And the visual grammar established by Zhao and Zhao represents a total rejection of typical biopic polish.
How so?
We all recognize the default look of a standard historical drama, right? The camera moves with stately, rigid grace on metal tracks. The lighting is perfectly balanced. The world feels like a museum exhibition that you're observing from a safe distance behind glass.
Yeah, very pristine.
They threw that entire playbook out. Instead, they opted for what industry professionals call handheld naturalism, or a nomadic, grounded style.
Can you define the physical reality of handheld naturalism for the listener? Like, what does that actually mean on a film set compared to a standard shoot?
Sure. In a standard historical shoot, the camera is often locked onto heavy metal dollies for perfectly smooth glides, or mounted on rigid tripods. The frame is mathematically perfect, but it's static.
Right.
Handheld naturalism means the camera operator is physically holding the rig, often using an easy rig or carrying it on their shoulder. It means the camera physically rises and falls with the breath of the operator.
Oh, wow.
So when an actor's voice breaks in a moment of grief, the camera operator reacts, allowing the frame to shake subtly. It creates a sense of casual immediacy. It tricks the viewer's brain into feeling like they are standing in the mud alongside these people, breathing the same air rather than just watching a choreographed play.
It's about matching the physical movement of the lens to the emotional frequency of the scene.
That's exactly it.
And that philosophy extends directly into how they lit the film. The lighting in Hamnet is practically a lead character, and there's a profound aggressive dichotomy between the two main locations, the Hathaway farm and the Henley house in Stratford. Let's break down the mechanics of the farm first.
Okay. The Hathaway farm, known historically as Hewlands, was filmed at a real National Trust property in the Herefordshire hamlet of Comau. And the production team didn't just dress it, they transformed it into a fully functioning Tudor farmstead.
Wow.
And the Zhao shot these sequences primarily in late summer and spring, relying almost exclusively on natural, dappled light.
It looks like these incredible golden hour frames straight out of a Renaissance painting, but because of the handheld camera work, it never feels artificial. But why use dappled light specifically?
Dappled light, light that is filtered through leaves and branches, is constantly shifting. It feels alive. It serves a very specific thematic purpose. It represents nature as a womb. Yeah, the expansiveness of the farm establishes Agnes's profound biological connection to the earth. Zhao explicitly framed this location as the extreme feminine environment. It's open, it's sentient, it breathes. It is the domain where Agnes possesses all her power and agency.
Right.
This is where the famous apple shack sequence takes place, the intimately lit scene where William and Agnes conceive their first child.
Okay, I have to interject here because the behind-the-scenes lore about that Apple Shack set is my favorite detail of the entire production.
It's so good.
It perfectly illustrates what we call method production design. They didn't just build a set that looked like an apple storage shed. They filled it with reality. The set decorator actually had their mother send little and imperfect apples from a private garden in Cornwall to ensure period accuracy.
Such a great detail.
They actively avoided shiny, genetically modified, perfectly round grocery store apples. They wanted the small, bruised, asymmetrical fruit that actually existed in the 16th century. It's that obsessive level of granular detail that grounds the actor's reality.
And that expansive, organic authenticity is violently, intentionally contrasted the moment the characters move to the Henley house in Stratford.
The atmosphere completely changes.
Completely. This is where William's family lives, and the visual grammar shifts dramatically to create a sense of deep architectural suffocation.
Tell me about the physical construction of that set, because they didn't shoot that in a real house, right? They built it entirely on a soundstage.
Yes, the Henley house was built at Elstree Studios by production designer Fiona Crombie, who previously won incredible acclaim for her work on The Favorite. She utilized reclaimed Tudor timbers and well-worn, historically accurate fabrics to build this incredibly specific, oppressive environment. And the defining architectural feature of the Henley house set was its incredibly low ceilings.
Which led to a hilarious recurring problem on set.
Oh, yeah.
The crew constantly had to yell out warnings to watch out for Joe Alwyn's head because he plays Agnes's brother, and the ceilings were literally too low for the taller actors to stand up straight in.
Yeah, it was a real hazard.
It sounds like a logistical nightmare for the camera crew, but that physical constraint translates directly into the thematic weight of the scenes.
It absolutely does. The physical suffocation of the architecture mirrors the psychological suffocation of the characters. When William is in this house, he is boxed in. The low ceilings represent the crushing weight of his familial duties, the economic anxiety of his class, and, most importantly, the oppressive presence of his abusive father, John Shakespeare, played with terrifying intensity by David Wilmot. The extreme feminine openness and natural light of the farm is completely swallowed up by the extreme masculine oppression of the Henley house.
And Zhao's lighting completely changes here, right? We lose the dappled sunlight.
Entirely. The Henley house is lit almost exclusively by candlelight. This isn't just to be period accurate. It utilizes the physics of the inverse square law of light.
Wait, what does that mean?
So candlelight falls off into deep shadow very quickly. So you have these characters whose faces are illuminated in warm, flickering light, but they are entirely surrounded by impenetrable, looming shadows. It is the visual manifestation of William's trapped imagination. He is a genius suffocating in the dark.
Wow. And to make those candlelit rooms feel genuinely 16th century, you can't fill them with modern faces. The casting of the background artists was just as rigorous as the lead roles.
Oh, yes. Casting director Nina Gold employed a very specific methodology for the background artists. She actively, aggressively avoided anyone who looked modern. She wasn't looking for polished extras who just needed a costume. She sought out individuals whose faces looked like they had been shaped by the harsh realities of the 1500s.
Right. No perfect orthodontist straightened teeth.
Hmm.
No modern symmetrical haircuts, no one who looked like they spent 3 days a week at a Pilates
Yeah.
studio. They needed faces with real texture, faces that looked like they belonged in the mud and the cold. But the authenticity of this production didn't stop at the architecture, the lighting, or the faces. It extended quite literally into the soil and the botany of the sets. And this is where we have to dive into what is undoubtedly the most staggering technical achievement of the film, the Hamnet herbarium.
This is a masterclass in method production design. It's so easy for a production to buy some fake plastic plants, stick them in a pot, and call it an apothecary. But Zhao understood that Agnes's entire identity, her power, and her tragedy are bound up in her relationship with the natural world.
Yeah.
So the production collaborated with a renowned British nursery owner named Jekka McVicker to grow 46 specific varieties of real herbs specifically for the film.
Wait, 46 varieties. They essentially grew a fully functioning, living, breathing 16th century pharmacy right there on the set.
Exactly.
Yeah.
These herbs functioned as the cleaning system, the medical cabinet, the perfumery, and the entire botanical ecosystem of the character's domestic reality. And they weren't just background dressing. They were integrated into the physical actions of the actors and the deep symbolism of the narrative.
Okay, we need to break this down.
Yeah, to understand the depth of this, let's look at the mechanics of a few key botanicals. Take mugwort, for example.
Mugwort is historically fascinating. It was believed to symbolize resilience and tenacity, and in 16th century apothecary science, it was actually thought to defeat pestilence.
Yes. And in the film, we don't just see it sitting in a jar. We see the physical process of it being mashed, ground down, and rendered into medicinal poultices.
Wow.
Then you have rue, historically known as the herb of grace. It was deliberately placed around the doorways of the sets. Why? Because in Tudor England, rue was utilized as a primary defense against witches, and more importantly, it was historically used to protect against the miasma of the plague.
So these aren't just random aesthetic choices to make the room look rustic.
Not at all.
Agnes is utilizing the absolute cutting-edge science of her day. But to the uneducated, terrified townsfolk around her, her deep botanical knowledge looks indistinguishable from witchcraft. She's desperately using every scientific tool at her disposal to fortify her home against the invisible, encroaching tide of death.
And then there is rosemary. Historically and explicitly within the text of Shakespeare's later work, rosemary symbolizes fidelity and remembrance.
Right. This immediately prefigures Ophelia's famous lines in Hamlet, "There's rosemary, that's for remembrance."
Precisely. But here is the mechanism of how that worked on set. The production actually burned real rosemary as incense to smudge the bee skips in the scenes.
So they weren't just using fog machines.
No, the literal scent of remembrance was physically lingering in the air that the actors were breathing while performing scenes about impending grief. It grounds the performance in olfactory reality.
And my absolute favorite detail, the one that will blow the minds of cinephiles tracking visual character arcs, is the use of madder root. Can you explain the chemistry of madder root and how it maps onto Agnes's psychological journey?
Oh, this is brilliant. Madder root was a crucial botanical used historically to create deep red and brown dyes. In the film, it is established that this root is used to dye Agnes's dresses. But the brilliance is in the execution over time.
What do you mean?
If you watch the film closely, the color saturation of her dresses darkens incrementally, scene by scene, as her grief intensifies. It requires a chemical process where the dye bonds deeper into the fabric with repeated exposure.
Wow.
Yeah, the production used this physical reality to represent her biological connection to nature, but more devastatingly, to visualize the deep-setting permanent stain of her loss.
It is the definition of cinematic alchemy. You take a mundane historical reality, using a root to dye a piece of wool, and you map it perfectly onto the psychological descent of your main character. And all of this intense botanical knowledge culminates in one of the most hypnotic scenes in the film, the chanting of the Nine Herbs charm.
The Naigon Wirta Geldor.
Yeah.
This is not an invention of the screenwriter. It is a real, recorded 10th century historical spell intended to treat poison and infection.
Oh, really?
Yeah. In the film, Agnes and her brother Bartholomew chant it in perfect unison. It serves as this profound cultural touchstone, linking Agnes to an ancient, oral, maternal lineage of knowledge that operates completely independently of the modern literary masculine world her husband is about to conquer in London.
It is an incredibly powerful sequence, but what I find even more fascinating is the psychological method behind how they achieved that magic. Because if you just hand two modern actors a piece of paper with a 10th century chant on it, it's going to sound ridiculous.
Very.
How did Zhao get her actors to tap into that ancient, almost mystical wavelength without it feeling contrived?
Now, if you are listening to this and you are prone to rolling your eyes at the idea of actors using mystical exercises to prepare for a role, I completely understand. It can often sound incredibly pretentious.
Yeah, very Hollywood.
But there is a biological, neurological reason why Zhao required it. She utilized intense somatic and tantric exercises on set.
Define somatic exercises in this context. How does that physically work?
Well, somatic exercises are designed to bypass the conscious intellectual brain and directly alter the nervous system. This wasn't about hitting marks and reciting dialogue perfectly. Zhao instituted daily 3 deep breath rituals, and crucially, she required the entire crew to participate, not just the cast.
Wait, the crew too?
Yes. When 50 people in a room sync their breathing, it physically lowers the collective heart rate. It alters the physiological state of the room. She was creating an atmosphere where the actors felt they were moving together with the camera operators and boom swingers in a collective unconscious. She needed them to, in her exact words, pull off a layer of skin to reach bone-deep humanity.
Pulling off a layer of skin. That sounds psychologically exhausting. And she took it even further than breathing exercises, didn't she?
She did. She actually required the actors to write down and send her their real, personal, intimate dreams during production. She used the imagery from their actual subconscious to stir the waters of their performances.
That is blurring a very dangerous line between the actor's own subconscious and the historical reality they are portraying. But I suppose that is exactly the point. It isn't just acting anymore. It's a collective hypnotic immersion. And it's vital to understand that these earthly grounding rituals, the hands in the dirt, the smell of the rosemary, the synced breathing, they were completely necessary for the next layer of the film. Because the actors were so physically grounded in the mud and the reality of their bodies, it allowed Zhao to introduce massive existential visual motifs without the film suddenly feeling like a detached, pretentious art project.
Exactly. The grounding allows for the poetry. So let's guide the listener through the poetry of the film. Let's decode the visual grammar and the cross-temporal Easter eggs for our audience, starting with the most prominent framing device, the red egg.
The red egg is literally the opening and closing image of the film. We see this striking red-dyed egg resting delicately in the gnarled roots of a moss-covered tree. What is the mechanical function of placing that specific image at the bookends of the story?
It immediately establishes the thematic vocabulary of the film. The egg universally represents life yet to be born, pure potential, and biological fertility.
Okay, so a classic symbol.
Yes, but by resting it inside the gnarled ancient roots of a tree, the frame juxtaposes the fragile newness of life against the deep, entrenched age of the earth. It tells the audience without a single line of dialogue that this is a story not just about human grief, but about the relentless and different biological cycle of birth, death, and return. The red dye visually connects it to the madder root of Agnes's dress and the inevitable blood of birth and pestilence.
And then we have the hawk, which is kept as Agnes's pet. There is a very specific, deliberate moment where she lets the hawk land directly on her bare arm without wearing the thick leather falconer's glove.
That physical action is a pure distillation of her character. It signifies her wildness, yes, but more importantly, it shows her profound desire to feel everything without barriers.
Even the pain.
Yes, she deliberately refuses to protect her flesh from the sharp talons of the natural world, just as she ultimately refuses to protect her psyche from the sharp, devastating reality of her grief. She chooses to bleed rather than to be numb.
That is a beautiful character detail. But the most challenging motif to capture practically had to be the pollen. When you read the screenplay, it reveals that Zhao explicitly introduced the concept of air as a central motif. Now, as any cinematographer will tell you, air is essentially impossible to represent visually. You cannot film nothing. So how did they solve that?
They made the invisible visible through the use of pollen. During the gold hour scene, specifically when William and Agnes first meet and are falling in love, the air is thick with practical and VFX pollen.
Oh, those scenes are gorgeous.
The camera catches the light, reflecting off millions of tiny, floating particles. On a narrative level, it symbolizes the fertility of their union. But on a mechanical level, it highlights the invisible interconnectivity of life. It shows the audience that every character is physically breathing the exact same shared ecosystem. The air isn't empty, it is a conduit for life, and later, a conduit for the plague.
But the most shocking visual inspiration and unquestionably the heaviest thematic anchor in the entire film is the concept of the black hole, or the void.
Yes, in the film's opening sequence, the camera makes this incredible floating, disembodied move. It drops down like a falling leaf into a dark, mysterious, seemingly bottomless pit in the earth. This visual motif of the dark void returns repeatedly throughout the runtime, representing the inescapable abyss of death.
The behind-the-scenes origin of this imagery is staggering, and I want us to really pause and unpack this because it is the most controversial choice in the film. Zhao was scouting locations in a forest in Wales, specifically in Gloucestershire's Lydney Forest during early spring, and she found these natural pits and depressions in the earth. But the concept of the void didn't fully solidify into the film's visual grammar until she received a piece of footage from a colleague.
A colleague sent her raw, frontline footage from the war in Kyiv, Ukraine. The footage showed massive landmine holes, artillery craters, and military dugouts gouged violently into the earth.
Wow.
Yeah, and Zhao saw the shape of those modern craters and decided to map that exact visual geometry onto the Elizabethan plague pits in her film.
We really need to debate the philosophical weight of this. That is an unbelievable cross-temporal link to make. You have a director conceptualizing the emotional devastation of a 16th century family losing a single child to the bubonic plague, and she anchors it visually in the scarred, bombed-out landscape of modern-day warfare in Ukraine. Does trauma truly look the same across 4 centuries? Isn't there a cognitive dissonance in using the shape of modern artillery to visualize Elizabethan grief?
It is a massive swing, and it is where the film makes its boldest thesis statement. The connection asserts that while the instruments of death change, a plague flea versus an artillery shell, the physical and psychological crater left behind in the human soul is identical.
The crater in the soul.
Exactly. By making that visual connection, she transforms a 1596 historical tragedy into a universal, timeless thesis on human trauma. The void left by a plague, the void left by a bomb, the void left by an 11-year-old boy dying in his bed, it is the exact same bottomless pit. It forces the modern viewer to realize that grief isn't a historical artifact. It is an active, ongoing human condition.
It bridges the gap. It tells the audience, you aren't just looking at people in funny clothes from 400 years ago. You are looking at the exact same terror that exists in the world today. And all of this intense psychological preparation, the somatic breathing, the dream sharing, the heavy thematic weight of warfare and plagues, it all acted as a pressure cooker. And that pressure eventually reached a boiling point on set during the filming of the climax.
The Globe Theater sequence. This is where the emotional bill finally comes due.
To understand the intensity of this sequence, we have to look at the architectural layout of the set. The stage at the Globe is visually represented in the film in a very specific way.
Yes. The expert set design here is crucial. The stage is visually framed as a temple of dead trees. It is built entirely from raw, recycled timber. This is the central metaphor of the film made physical. William Shakespeare has taken the dead timber of his personal tragedy, his dead son, and recycled it into a commercial product. He has literally built a temple of public performance out of his own private grief.
And this setting is where we get the story of the massive, unscripted on-set conflict. Now, when we say conflict here, we don't mean diva behavior or actors complaining about their trailers. We are talking about an intense, passionate disagreement regarding the geometric and emotional truth of the scene.
Right. It was a sightline conflict.
Yeah.
The geometry of the scene requires Agnes to be standing in the crowded audience, looking up at the elevated stage to see the older Hamlet, played by Noah Jupe, the biological brother of the actor who played her dead son. The camera was initially positioned by the crew in a way that captured the action perfectly, but it physically obstructed the direct line of sight between Jessie Buckley down in the crowd and Paul Mescal up on the stage.
And the actors flatly refused to proceed. They stopped the production.
Yeah, they stopped everything.
They demanded that the camera be moved so they could physically see each other's eyes. They understood that if they were just acting to a piece of tape on a camera lens, the closed-loop feedback system they had built would break. They needed that unbroken biological connection to maintain the reality of the moment.
And Paul Mescal later revealed what happened the moment the crew finally moved the camera and the two actors locked eyes across the set. He said it was an immediate, overwhelming realization of, oh no.
Oh no. That is such a chilling way to describe it because the grief they had cultivated was so real, so palpable in the room. that it was genuinely terrifying for them to confront it in each other.
It was a moment of shared, unsimulated emotional devastation. And that unbroken visual connection culminated in what is now considered one of the most powerful moments in modern cinema. An entirely unscripted, visceral scream from Jessie Buckley.
Still gives me chills.
It was not written in the screenplay. It wasn't planned in rehearsal. It was a pure, gut-wrenching, physiological reaction that completely broke the fourth wall of their own performative grief. That single, agonizing sound is widely cited by critics as the exact moment she secured her Academy Award.
Because it is the purest sound of a mother recognizing her dead child resurrected as a ghost for public consumption. It is horrifying and beautiful all at once. But this brings up a massive logistical and psychological question. How on earth does a cast and crew sustain that level of agonizing, bone-deep grief for a 12-hour shoot day without having a collective nervous breakdown?
That is the ultimate challenge of directing trauma. You cannot push human beings to that physiological edge take after take without providing a biological safety net. And this is where we have to discuss the mechanism of the Rihanna release.
Yes. The viral dance breaks. You have this incredibly heavy, emotionally wrecking atmosphere, and then suddenly, these behind-the-scenes videos leak online showing the cast still dressed in heavy, muddy 16th century peasant attire, having massive, joyous, sweaty dance breaks to Rihanna's We Found Love. It looks utterly bizarre out of context.
While it might seem like just a quirky juxtaposition for social media, it is actually a vital, calculated part of Zhao's directorial process. It represents the community of feeling she deliberately engineered on set.
How does dancing to pop music function mechanically in that environment?
It functions biologically as a cortisol release. When you act out profound grief, your body doesn't know it's acting. Your brain releases stress hormones, cortisol, and adrenaline, as if the trauma is real. You have to expel that chemical buildup.
Okay, so the dancing was medicinal.
Exactly. The joy, the physical exertion of the dancing, the modern music, it acted as a vital pressure valve. It was the only biological way the cast could survive the psychological toll of the material. Zhao described her role not just as a visual architect, but as the captain of a ship, tuning everyone to her calmness to ensure they felt safe. Jessie Buckley noted that this joyous atmosphere was exactly what allowed her to safely navigate the raw anger and fear required for Agnes. The dancing wasn't a distraction from the deep work, it was the biological mechanism that made the intense work sustainable.
It is a profound tightrope walk. You have devastating historical grief on one side and a vibrant modern community of feeling acting as the safety net on the other. And it is exactly that brilliant balancing act that propelled the film out of the art house and into the global cultural stratosphere. Which brings us to the legacy of the film, because Hamnet didn't just succeed, it completely shifted the industry paradigm for how we view Shakespeare on screen.
It did. For nearly 3 decades, the dominant cultural touchstone for a Shakespeare origin story was John Madden's Shakespeare in Love.
Which, to be fair, is a brilliantly constructed film in its own right, winning Best Picture.
Yep.
But it is fundamentally a romantic comedy. Its primary themes are romantic inspiration, witty banter, and overcoming writer's block. It has a distinct lightness of touch.
Exactly. Shakespeare in Love treats the creation of art as a joyous, romantic puzzle. Hamnet, on the other hand, is an emotional powerhouse that posits art is born from gaping wounds. Critics have noted that it holds a candle not to romantic comedies, but to dark, searing, bittersweet masterpieces of grief like Frankenstein or Wake Up Dead Man. It completely replaced the romantic muse trope with a fierce, mystical exploration of trauma and the biological cycle of life. It treats Agnes not as a pretty muse to be kissed and discarded, but as the true, complex, suffering engine of the story.
And crucially, it proved to the Hollywood financial apparatus that there is a massive appetite for this level of emotional depth. Industry chatter initially framed the film as a risky proof of concept for mid-budget, theatrically released adult dramas. In a theatrical landscape totally dominated by superhero algorithms, sequels, and risk-averse studio filmmaking, here comes a muddy, sensory, violently sad 16th century tragedy.
And it worked financially and critically. The heavy-hitting involvement of Steven Spielberg's Amblin Entertainment and Sam Mendes' Neil Street Productions bolstered its industry cachet, ensured it remained at the center of the Oscar spotlight, and ultimately resulted in 8 Academy Award nominations.
But of course, whenever a film achieves that level of cultural ubiquity and emotional intensity, it inevitably attracts dissenting voices. Right, and we do need to address the critics here, specifically voices like Patrick Sproul from The Independent. He argued quite aggressively that the film felt artificial and emotionally manipulative, suggesting that crafting a film specifically designed to make you cry is not proof of expert filmmaking, but rather a calculated assault on the audience's tear ducts. He felt the manipulation of the emotions was too transparent.
It is a valid critique of the melodrama genre as a whole. When a film pushes the emotional buttons that hard and utilizes swelling music and tragic deaths, some viewers will naturally put up their defenses, resist the narrative, and feel manipulated by the filmmaker.
But I have to push back hard on that critique in this specific instance.
Huh.
What is the line between manipulation and art? When a filmmaker takes a 400-year-old historical blank slate, a missing fossil, and uses the most rigorous, neurologically taxing method acting, the most exhaustively researched botanical production design, and cross-temporal visual metaphors linking Elizabethan plagues to modern warfare to create a fully realized, breathing sensory world that isn't manipulation. That is cinematic alchemy. Manipulation implies a cheap trick. It implies a shortcut. There is absolutely nothing cheap about growing 46 varieties of herbs to ensure your actors physically smell the reality of the 16th century. There is nothing cheap about an actor pulling off a layer of skin to deliver an unscripted scream of pure agony at the Globe Theater.
I agree completely. That is not manipulation, that is the ultimate reconciliation of history and art. The film boldly suggests that the most famous play in human history was not born from dry, calculated literary ambition, but from a tender, agonizing love letter written in the dark shadow of an 11-year-old boy's unmarked grave. While the historical ledger may only record 3 bare, calcified facts about a life, art possesses the unique, terrifying power to restore its pulsing veins.
And that brings us to our final thought. We've spent this entire deep dive examining the mechanisms of how art can address, explore, and attempt to reconcile deep personal pain. But what Hamnet ultimately implies, with its suffocating low ceilings and its recurring motifs of bottomless voids, is that art can never fully heal that pain. The writing of the masterpiece didn't bring the boy back to life. The temple of dead trees is still made of dead wood. The grief remains. So the next time you watch a cinematic masterpiece or read a play born of profound personal tragedy, ask yourself this. Is the brilliant beauty of the art we consume worth the unhealed wound the artist had to endure to create it? Thank you for joining us on this journey between the lines of history and cinema.